So, welcome. Again, it's nice to have you with me this evening for this presentation, Being Awake, Living Abundantly. This is sponsored by the UU Association of Membership Professionals, UUAMP, which I am a proud member of, and the Central East Regional Group of the UUA, which I am a staff member of. Again, I'm talking to you in my home just outside Philadelphia. And I'm happy to say that we have people here tonight, not only from the Central East region, but across other regions in the UUA. So let's begin our presentation. And what I'd like to do is to light our virtual candle first and offer you some opening words from John McKnight and Peter Block, the authors of the book that I will be speaking about this evening. They write, an abundant, or what some call a beloved community, reminds us of our power to create a full and complete life. It assures us that when we join together with our neighbors, we are the architects of the future that we want to live within. The words of John McKnight and Peter Block. The presentation this evening is based on and inspired by the book, The Abundant Community, Awakening the Power of Families and Neighborhoods. Again, the authors are John McKnight, who has done a great deal of work with people with developmental disabilities, another area that is close to my heart. And Peter Block, who has written several books, including Community, the Structure of Belonging, which is my Bible and the book that I use in virtually every presentation that I do in my work with UU congregations. This book inspired me. There are incredible ideas that come out of it, and the challenge and the fun for me is adapting those ideas to our congregations, and I hope you find it as exciting as I have. There are three questions that we're going to address this evening. The first one is, can congregations be oases in a sea of consumerism and institutionalism that has permeated so much of our society today? And I will elaborate greatly on what that means embodied in that question. The second question that we'll tackle is, what does it mean for a congregation to come from a position of abundance rather than scarcity in terms of what it has to offer its members and the wider world? And thirdly, what are the universal qualities of a powerful and competent spiritual community, and how do we realize those qualities in our congregations? Let me begin with a short treatise on what I think are the major barriers to becoming a powerful and competent congregation, the issues that congregations continue to wrestle with. And I speak of this not as an expert, but as someone who has had the opportunity to be on the balcony for the last 6 years in many congregations across our region. Here are some of the barriers, here are some of the issues that I think congregations are dealing with. Congregations are feeling stuck. There is a sense that the congregation is not moving forward numerically and otherwise. Visitors are coming on Sundays, but they're not coming back. Or they do come back, but they don't become members of the congregation. Or they become members of the congregation, but they don't stay very long and they go out the back door. Leaders continue to complain of burnout. I hear it all the time. And they lament the fact that there were never enough volunteers to do the work of the congregation. I suspect there are many of you out there that are nodding your heads right now. Unmanaged conflict is ever present, and communication across the congregation is poorly executed or non-existent. And relationships between members are strained and often marked by a sense of competition, where the goal of individuals or groups is to defeat the other, even though it's not expressly stated. A lot of the difficulties that we see in congregations stems from the fact that many members adopt what McKnight and Block call a consumer mentality. A consumer mentality. It relates to the prevalence of consumerism in our society. The idea that we have surrendered to others the power to provide what is essential for a full and satisfied life. The consumer mindset, which I'll refer to often this evening, holds that satisfaction can be purchased. Not just goods, but everything, from happiness to healing, from love to laughter, from educating a child to caring for someone at the end of life. And so we expect teachers, coaches, agencies to raise our children. We expect doctors to keep us healthy. We expect social workers and institutions to take care of the vulnerable in our society. We hire consultants to do the work that we cannot do or don't have time for. As a result of this consumer mindset, say McKnight and Block, we become isolated from other members of our community. We engage in competition rather than collaboration, and we become dissatisfied with our lot in life. So how then does this consumer mindset impact on our congregations? Does this attitude of paying for services apply to the institutions that we've created? I think it does. In our congregations, many members attend worship regularly, or they always show up for church social events. They make and they pay their pledge on time, but they don't volunteer. This is the consumer mindset at work in our UU congregations. By pledging, they are paying for the services that they receive from the congregation. There is no other sense of obligation to the congregation because their orientation is that the church is like every other institution. You pay and you receive services. In this case, spiritual, social, educational services. So, for example, you might see members expecting religious education services for their children and for other adults, but they don't volunteer to teach them. Or they expect an excellent cup of coffee after the worship service, but they never consider volunteering to make coffee. These are the folks in our congregation who tend to remain isolated. They may be social with others, but there is no true connection with others. And ultimately, I believe their dissatisfaction as members will increase and they will eventually leave the congregation. McKnight and Block also talk about the prevalence in our society of a system or institutionalized way of life. This is related closely to the consumer mindset. A system life is a way of living that is not our own, but is named by another. So how does this relate to our congregations? Well, we often, I believe, intentionally or not, create systems and institutions in our congregations that perpetuate this mindset. Let me explain. While leaders often complain mightily about burnout and no one stepping up to help, they may consciously or unconsciously create environments that spurn the involvement of others or the cultivation of future leaders. They don't want to give up their control or their power, and they don't want to admit it. So they make it difficult for change to happen, for new ideas to be tried out. We know that there are many congregations that have more committees than chairs in the sanctuary. Communication is very formal or sometimes non-existent. If someone wants to volunteer, they are welcome to, but told exactly what to do and where to fit into the system. There is no room for creativity, for trying something new, because the institution, the system, has always functioned this way. And so people who otherwise would become involved Instead, fall back into the consumer mindset, thinking, if the system is already in place and no one wants to change it, then I'll just pay for the system to meet my needs. Here you go. Here's my annual pledge. Here's a profound statement on my part. Church shouldn't be work. In our consumer-driven society, we are working all the time. We take work home. We work overtime. So when we experience congregational life, we don't want to see it as work, and so we avoid getting involved. We need to start seeing church as fun and spiritual and fulfilling and not as work. We find congregational life unsatisfying because we feel we have to work at it. And this is consistent with the consumer mindset. We can't work and enjoy church at the same time. And so we feel we have to choose between the two. The final way in which the consumer systems mindset serves as a barrier to healthy, growing congregations is in the consideration of competition. In the consumer mindset, where paying for services is the norm, it is expected that services will compete for the attention and the money of the consumer. So people in this mindset expect competition, and competition inevitably creates conflict. In our congregations, while the idea of competition is anathema, those with a consumer mindset feel it is inevitable. And so safeguards against harmful competition, such as the creation of congregational covenants, do not occur. We'll talk more about covenants and competition later on in this presentation, and talk to you about the competent community. I hope you agree from the presentation so far that the consumer mindset poses many barriers to the presence of healthy, vital, and growing congregations. What I want to do now is to move from, as McKnight and Block put it, critique to possibility. I love that, critique to possibility. I find that in my work as a consultant, I tend to do too much criticism of what we're not doing or what we're doing wrong, rather than talk about the possibilities of what we can do well. So let's start by defining our terms. The competent community, and again, I'll be using that a lot throughout the rest of the presentation. It is characterized by people who live in a way that they have chosen, who experience a more satisfied life than most. They see themselves not as consumers, but as citizens of the congregation, with a responsibility to be the creators and producers of their future. They believe that they are cause, not effect, that the health of the congregation is their responsibility just as much as it is the responsibility of their fellow members. It is the opposite of the consumer mindset. It's also important to note that competent communities recognize the quality of abundance. And I'll often use competent and abundant community interchangeable. What then are the qualities of an abundant community? An abundant community is marked by a collective accountability that can be created only in relationship to other people. To live abundantly is to celebrate variety, uniqueness, and appreciation for the one of a kind. There are 4 tenets, according to McKnight and Block, of an abundant community. The first, what we have is enough. The focus is on the gifts, strengths, and talents of the community and not on what is missing or sought after. We believe in a common vision. The community has the capacity to collectively handle an uncertain future and to endure and transcend whatever faces them. It is the belief that the community can create together a future beyond this moment. Number 3, we are responsible for each other. Our future is dependent on each of us, And if one of us is not valued or participating or satisfied, then it is not possible for any of us to realize this common vision. And four, we live with reality, with the reality of the human condition. We understand what we can and cannot do. We understand that sometimes people will fail or will let the community down, that people will leave or get angry, and we recognize this as inevitable and natural. These then are the qualities of the abundant community, and we'll again refer to them throughout this presentation. So what do competent communities do? Again, competent communities are characterized by this idea of abundance. Three things. They focus on the gifts of their members, they nurture associational life, and they offer hospitality, the welcoming of strangers. A competent community builds on the gifts of its people. We need to see our congregations as treasure chests, where we open the box and discover the gifts and skills that are inside. Focusing on our gifts rests on the belief and understanding that what we have is enough, that satisfaction and growth and health in our congregation is contained not in something outside our walls, but exists in the strengths and talents of its members right here within our walls. When we decide to build a competent community, we do not need to be divided by differences. In focusing on people's gifts, we find common ground. We speak to their gifts rather than to their differing values or perspectives. The second property is associational life, which is fundamentally a group of people who have a shared affinity. It begins with people who are drawn together for some reason, and that reason is what makes the association work. In our congregations, this shared affinity, this reason for being together, is our mission. It is one of the reasons why I believe and preach the need for a clear and compelling mission that is so essential to the success of our congregations. The mission clearly and boldly states who you are and why you come together. It is what makes our congregations work. In choosing to participate in associational life, one chooses to be in a more formal relationship with a group of people. You want to be with them for your own interests and for their interests as well. That is why connection between and among members of a congregation is so important. Being in relationship is an essential part of being a Unitarian Universalist and being part of a healthy, vital, and growing congregation. And the third property is hospitality, the welcoming of strangers. And I've done so many presentations and workshops and webinars on this idea of hospitality and welcoming. And yet I continue to go into congregations and don't see it happening to my level of expectation. Hospitality, according to McKnight and Block, is the essence of community competence. It is the signature of not only an abundant community, but a confident one. A confident one. The extent of hospitality becomes a measure of the belief that people have in their community. When a community is not confident, when it is worried or conflicted, when it is unable to trust or feels threatened, it is unable to be hospitable. Isn't that great? Hospitality is generated because people feel so good about themselves that they want others to share it, and they want to share the joy of others. It's why I look so carefully at how welcoming people are when I come into a congregation. To me, it says a lot about the psyche of the congregation, how confident, how happy, how satisfied, how proud they are to be who they are. Let's take just a moment to digress a bit and talk about friendship and trust as critical components of hospitality and of being a competent community. Friendship and trust, say McKnight and Block, is the means through which something that was an individual quality now becomes a communal reality. Something that was an individual quality now becomes a communal reality. In the consumer world, trust is embodied in the establishment of formal contracts. In the world of competent communities, trust is expressed through our word, through the promises we make to each other. What I'm talking about here clearly is covenant, the foundation of our faith. We covenant to be with each other, and the glue that holds that covenant together is trust. Congregations without formal covenants run the risk of losing or violating trust. Covenants of right relations, then, become important components of the competent community, of the strong, vital, and healthy congregation. I did a presentation last June at General Assembly and asked the group, there were, probably about 100 people or so in the room, how many of them had a formal congregational covenant or covenant of right relations. I'd say about half raised their hand. We need to have a higher percentage than that, I believe. So putting these three components of a competent community together, we see that gifts are the raw material for community, associations are the processes through which the gifts are exchanged, and hospitality is what widens our inventory of gifts. And the three interrelate. One plays off the other two. For example, when we focus on gifts, we create association. When we have strong association, we're able to offer hospitality. But strong association can also build gifts, and hospitality can invite stronger association. This doesn't proceed in any sequence. You can enter this community at any point and anywhere you like. So we've talked about the three properties of a competent community. These properties, in turn, create conditions for the emergence of certain capacities. Capacities are the core elements that need to be visible and manifest to create an abundant community. They are the core elements that need to be visible and manifest to create an abundant community. And they include kindness, generosity, cooperation, forgiveness, acceptance of fallibility, and mystery. Properties and capacities are abundant and exist as a potential in everybody. As you move from properties and capacities to the right, the lower right, you see that they await a nurturing context in which to be manifested. For us, that nurturing context is our congregational life. Down at the bottom, when the nurturing context is manifested, it is evidence that a community has become competent. And when the community becomes competent, it produces satisfaction. This satisfaction, in turn, reinforces the properties and capacities that exist in the community. And so the cycle begins again. As the properties and capacities are reinforced, it strengthens the nurturing context. That, in turn, creates a stronger, competent community, which increases satisfaction and reinforces further the properties and capacities, and so on. Let me take a brief look at each of the 6 capacities in a little bit more detail. So, kindness. Kindness is a relationship to another that is embedded in love, care, and respect. It is the embodiment of our first principle, respecting the inherent worth and dignity of others. Generosity goes beyond kindness. It is to make an offer for its own sake, not in exchange for something of equal value. It is giving to another with no expectation of return. Generosity is serving the community only for the benefit of the community and not for oneself. It is the opposite of the consumer mindset, which expects and requires a return on investment in exchange of goods or favors. Cooperation is captured perfectly in the quote by Alfie Kohn, and I quote, "For me to win, you must win. For me to prosper and find satisfaction and have peace of mind, then you must prosper and have peace of mind." Unquote. The opposite of cooperation is competition, and competition is a celebration not of abundance, but of scarcity. In too many of our congregations, healthy debate and disagreement dissolves into competition where members are competing to win. In reality, in those environments, no one wins. Cooperation is based on the belief that there is enough for each of us, the abundance mentality. It is a willingness to debate and argue in a way that sustains the relationship and the integrity of the congregation as a whole. When there is a spirit of cooperation in our congregation, no one leaves the table. This is one of the telltale signs of the competent community. Cooperation, I believe, is also represented in our second principle: justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. I've combined forgiveness and fallibility in the next block. Forgiveness is the willingness to come to terms with having been wounded. Forgiveness is the willingness to come to terms with having been wounded. It is required when we make the decision to be and to worship together in this faith. Forgiveness means we acknowledge that people are fallible and we find a way to accept it. We understand that fallibility is part of the human condition and that in community people will make mistakes. In our covenantal relationships, we accept the mistake, we forgive, and we begin again in love. Our third principle captures this well: acceptance of one another and encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations. And finally, mystery. A competent community creates space for what is unknowable about life. A community welcomes mystery, gains strength from letting questions go unanswered, creates a sense of aliveness that comes from realizing there is more than we know. This, folks, is spirituality in our faith tradition, one of the sources of our living tradition, which states, direct experience of that transcending mystery and wonder affirmed in all cultures, which moves us to a renewal of the spirit and an openness to the forces which create and uphold life. So do you see how the creation of a competent community, an abundant community, is so much in line with the principles that underlie our Unitarian Universalist faith? McKnight and Block also talk about the importance of democracy in the abundant community, the need for members of the community to exercise their rights as citizens. This again is consistent with our fifth principle: use of the democratic process within our congregations and our society at large. So let me begin to wrap up this presentation with some suggestions based on what I presented that can serve hopefully as a blueprint for creating the competent, abundant community in your congregation. Number one, hold fast to your mission and vision and let it guide everything you do in your congregation. If you don't have a clear and compelling mission and vision, then get one. Talk to me offline about ways in which you can do this. If you do have a clear and compelling mission and vision, then make it part of the DNA of your congregation and your membership. Display it, read it, talk about it, refer to it. It is the essence of associational life, the idea that we are together for a common purpose now and as we move into the future. Secondly, make visible the gifts of everyone in your congregation. Identify the skills, talents, and passions of the people in your community and invite them to share these qualities with others. We find that as we share our gifts, new kinds of connections and relationships are created. We cross lines previously drawn between youth and adults, newer members and veteran members, even humanists and theists. Sharing our gifts also enables the community to gain a greater sense of trust and power as the congregation shares in creating a future together. At the end of this presentation, I'll provide you with a link to a workshop recorded at last year's General Assembly in which members of my home congregation, the UU Church of Delaware County in Media, Pennsylvania, talk about our Growth Through Service program. It's an initiative that is successfully bringing out the gifts of members and matching them with service opportunities in the congregation. Number 3, welcome the stranger. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Welcome them enthusiastically and genuinely. Make it part of your culture. Pay attention to those who may be alone or feeling isolated. Notice when others in your congregation welcome the stranger and thank them for doing so, or have a frank conversation with them when you see that they do not. Invite friends and neighbors to visit your congregation anonymously and ask them about their experiences. Get involved in an anonymous visitor exchange with another congregation. I have another link for you on the resources page that will offer suggestions on how to do this. Number 4, covenant to learn and be and struggle together. Our faith was built on the idea of covenant, the promises that we make to each other. Yet a significant percentage of our congregations do not have a congregational covenant, or otherwise known as a covenant of right relations. If you don't have one, create one. Talk to me offline about a process for coming up with a congregational covenant. If you do have one, make sure every member of the congregation has a copy, knows it, and believes in it. Introduce it to visitors and new members on their path to membership. Again, I'll have a resource for you that can help you, that can give you some greater ideas about creating a covenant and the benefit of covenant in our communities. And then finally, live our principles authentically and intentionally. Our principles are the embodiment of a competent, abundant community. Yet how many of our members even know the 7 principles, much less live them every day, both in the congregation and in the wider world? Make your principles the foremost document in your congregation. Put them in your order of service, on your website. Make them the subject of covenant groups or small group ministry groups. Talk about how you live out your principles in your congregational and societal lives. I put together a 3-session workshop for my congregation a couple of years ago on living our principles. I'll be happy to share the curriculum with you. These 5 building blocks then are all we need to build the competent, abundant, beloved community. There is no magic formula. There is no knight on a white horse that will ride up to your doors and rescue your congregation. Within our congregations, we have the talent, we have the gifts, we have the ability, we have the power, we have the choice to achieve all of this, and so create the congregation we dream about. It takes work, but it is loving work. It takes time, but time is not necessarily of the essence. It takes courage. But as Unitarian Universalists, we come from a long line of courageous and determined people. My advice, start where you are now in your congregation and build from there. So here are some additional resources. And I'm happy to talk with you or email you at any time in order to elaborate on these resources or answer any questions or provide any assistance that I can. So first and foremost, I recommend that if you haven't already, log on to our regional website, surguua.org. There is a wealth of materials on there, both written resources, on-demand webinars, and YouTube videos. We have a program on the website, a Moodle program, and you can see the URL there. If you click on that, it will take you to our on-demand webinars, but you'll need to register, and registration is free. And for example, there's a video on mission in action, and below mission in action, you have the URL for that. There's the video on seeing with new eyes, something that I created, which includes a blueprint for setting up an anonymous visitors program with other congregations or with other people in the community. The video that I referred to that was made at General Assembly by my home congregation is the URL underneath the Growth Through Service. Again, I'll also be happy to send you the PowerPoint presentation of this presentation with the notes pages and other PowerPoint presentations that I've done on welcoming the stranger, for example. All you need to do is email me at mbernstein@uua.org and tell me what you need, and I'll be happy to send it to you. Let me close with these words by Lois Schmidt. A great community creates conditions where people can fall in love. It is a place where we can make a fuss about one another, a place where we can ask, how did I ever live without you? Isn't that nice? And now I will extinguish the candle. And thank you for attending.